Before we dive into tonight's tale, make sure to hit that subscribe button if you want more creepy stories that will keep you up at night. I don't know when my fascination with the occult turned into an obsession. Maybe it was the first time I stumbled across one of those old, yellowed books in the university archives, filled with folklore and whispered warnings. Or maybe it was later when I realized some of those warnings weren't just superstition. Either way, by the time I found the ledger, I was already too deep. It wasn't just a book. It felt wrong. The kind of wrong that makes the air in a room feel too thick, like it's pressing against your skin. The cover was leather, cracked and dry, with no title. Just a symbol embossed in the center, something that looked like a circle, but not quite. The pages inside were brittle, filled with dense handwriting that shifted between careful precision and frantic, uneven scrawls. It detailed disappearances, old rituals, strange occurrences tied to a cemetery on the outskirts of New Orleans. I remember sitting in that dimly lit archive, flipping through the pages with trembling fingers. The deeper I read, the more I felt it, that pull. The sense that this wasn't just another piece of forgotten history. It was something active, something that wanted to be understood. That's what led me here. Not money, not some casual curiosity. I needed to see if the ledger was telling the truth. I needed to know if those names, the ones listed under Lost, had really vanished without a trace. So when I found the job listing for a night watchman at the cemetery, I didn't hesitate. I should have. But I didn't. The cemetery looked exactly how you'd expect. Overgrown grass, crumbling headstones, wrought iron gates rusted at the hinges. But there was something else, something that felt off, like the whole place was holding its breath. I spent the first couple of hours wandering the grounds, getting familiar with the layout. The ledger had mentioned an old mausoleum near the back, one that predated the rest of the cemetery by decades. That was my first stop. The air inside was stale, thick with dust, and the scent of decayed wood. My flashlight beam swept across stone coffins and broken plaques, illuminating names that hadn't been spoken in 100 years. And then, tucked in the corner, half buried under a pile of brittle papers, I found them. The notes. They were written on torn scraps of paper, some of them barely legible. The handwriting varied, like multiple people had added to them over time. Some lines were scratched out, others were rewritten over and over, as if the writer wanted to make sure they got it right. But the message was clear. They weren't instructions. They were warnings. I sat on the cold stone floor and read each one carefully, the weight of them settling into my bones. Rule 1. Never answer the ancient rotary phone in the caretaker's booth after 2 a.m. Rule 2. Do not unlock the tomb of the silent ones after midnight. Rule 3. If you hear unnerving whispers emanating from the headstones, remain perfectly motionless. Rule 4. Avoid the stained glass corridor in the mausoleum after the lights flicker. Rule 5. Never read aloud from any ancient journal found on a gravestone. Rule 6. If a shadow detaches itself from your body, do not pursue or reclaim it. There was nothing extra written here, but the edges of the paper were burnt, like someone had tried to destroy it and failed. By the time I finished reading, my hands were shaking. I looked around the mausoleum, half expecting to see someone standing in the shadows watching, but there was nothing. Just the weight of the silence pressing in, the dust swirling in the beam of my flashlight. I should have walked away, right then, right there, but I didn't. Because the worst part, somewhere deep down, I already believed every word. Midnight crept in unnoticed. I hadn't checked the time, honestly, I hadn't wanted to. But something in the air shifted. The temperature dropped so fast that my breath curled in front of me, and the usual night sounds, the distant hum of the city, the rustling of tree branches, vanished. Then the cemetery changed. It started with the gravestones. At first, I thought it was a trick of my flashlight, the way the beam reflected off the damp stone. But then I saw it clearly. Some of the headstones were glowing. A faint, pulsing light, like something underneath was struggling to surface. And then came the whispers. Soft at first, just a faint murmur carried on the wind. But as I stepped closer, the voices grew clearer. They weren't just random noises. They were conversations, fragments of words, echoes of the past, looping over and over like a broken record. I didn't want to say it, but the voices came like this. Not yet, please. She knows. She knows, and it's too late. I saw what's in the coffin. It wasn't empty. I swallowed hard and turned my flashlight toward the nearest grave. That's when I saw it. The ground was moving. At first I thought it was just settling, maybe a trick of tired mind. But no, the earth was rising and falling. Slowly, steady, like something buried beneath was breathing. I took a step back, and my foot crunched against something soft. Looking down, I saw it, blackened moss growing in thick, unnatural patterns around the headstones. And it wasn't just moss. It was wet, oozing. The liquid clung to my boot like tar, thick and dark, smelling of copper and something else. Something burnt. The scent hit the back of my throat like cremation ash. I should have left, should have backed away, should have run, but my body refused to move. That's when I heard the rule in my head, as if someone had whispered it directly into my ear. Rule 3. If you hear unnerving whispers emanating from the headstones, remain perfectly motionless. I didn't question it. I froze. The air grew heavier, pressing against my skin like a lead weight. The whispers were getting closer, circling me. I felt them behind me, beside me, felt a breath at my neck, cold and unnatural. A low, guttural voice spoke directly into my ear. You're not supposed to be here. I clenched my jaw, fighting the primal urge to turn my head, to look. Every instinct screamed at me to run, but I didn't move. The whisper lingered for a second longer. Then slowly, it faded. The breath at my neck disappeared. The sounds around me thinned, retreating back into the night. It felt like an eternity before I dared to breathe again. The cemetery was silent once more. I turned and walked away, forcing my legs to move despite the shaking. I didn't look back, because some part of me knew, if I had, something would have been waiting. After that, the first ring shattered the silence. It wasn't like a normal phone ringing. There was no clear, mechanical chime. Instead, the sound was warped, drawn out, like something had slowed it down and stretched it into a low, distorted groan. I knew the rule. Rule 1. Never answer the ancient rotary phone in the caretaker's booth after 2 a.m. I wasn't planning to, but the phone kept ringing. Each shrill, unnatural chime scraped against my nerves, vibrating through the small caretaker's booth where I'd taken shelter after the incident with the graves. The phone sat on the desk, a heavy old thing, its brass dial worn smooth from decades of use. Dust coated the receiver, untouched for who knows how long. And yet it rang. 2:10 a.m. The ringing stopped. For a moment, silence. Then voices, not from the receiver, from inside the phone. A chorus of whispers bled from the rotary dial, rising and falling like waves crashing in a storm. I couldn't pick out a single voice at first. There were too many. Children crying, elderly murmuring prayers. Somewhere in the mix, a woman humming a funeral dirge, slow and mournful. I stepped back, every muscle in my body tight. Then one of the voices spoke my name. Not in a general way, not like someone calling for help. This voice knew me. Elias, why did you leave us? I felt my stomach drop. The voice was familiar, too familiar. My sister, but that wasn't possible. I hadn't heard her voice since she was 6 years old, since the night she disappeared. My breath hitched. The air in the booth turned dense, suffocating. It wasn't your fault. Another voice now. Different. Rough. A man's voice, low and scratchy, someone speaking through a throat full of gravel. I knew that voice too, my grandfather, but he'd been dead for over 20 years. I backed away, my pulse hammering in my ears. This wasn't real. It couldn't be real. And yet the voices kept coming. They whispered things no one should know. Things I had buried deeper than the graves outside. Regrets, guilt, moments I'd locked away, convinced no one else would ever hear them again. The whispers were clearer than I could ever imagine, like this. You should have checked the basement that night. Why didn't you answer the knock at the door? You were supposed to be watching her, Elias. My chest tightened. I pressed my hands to my ears, but the voices didn't stop. They slithered past the barriers, burrowing straight into my head, sinking deep into the places I didn't want to revisit. I staggered toward the phone. For one stupid moment, I almost grabbed the receiver. Some desperate part of me wanted to scream into it, demand to know who or what was speaking, wanted to hear my sister's voice again, just once. But I didn't, because I knew, if I picked up that phone, I wouldn't be the one ending the call. Something else would. The voices stopped. The phone sat silent, the rotary dial motionless. I exhaled shakily and backed away, my fingers clenched into fists to keep them from shaking. I shouldn't have gone inside, but after the phone, after the voices, after hearing names that should have been long buried, I needed air, needed space. So I left the booth and walked. The cemetery was different now. I could feel it, like the ground had shifted just slightly under my feet, just enough to be wrong. The graves still breathed, rising and falling in slow, unnatural movements. The wind had died completely, leaving the air thick and unmoving. And the mausoleum doors, once rusted shut, now stood open. The stained glass corridor waited beyond them. Rule 4. Avoid the stained glass corridor in the mausoleum after the lights flicker. The lights had flickered. Back when I was in the booth, right before the phone started ringing. I should have walked away. I didn't. The corridor was long and narrow, lined on both sides by towering stained glass windows. Moonlight streamed through the colored panes, casting shifting patterns across the marble floor. The air smelled of dust and decay, thick with the scent of old, undisturbed death. Then I saw the reflections. Not mine, not exactly. The first one looked like me, but younger. A kid, 10 years old. I knew that face, knew that moment. It was the last time I'd seen my sister. The child me stood in the glass, wearing the same shirt I'd worn that day. His hands were clenched at his sides, his mouth open in a silent scream. Behind him, the hallway was different, darker, wrong. I swallowed hard and stepped forward. The reflection changed. Now it was me, but old, bent, frail, skin sagging. A man at the end of his life, but not in a hospital, not in a home. Here, in this cemetery, alone. I felt my stomach turn. The old me raised a shaking hand and pressed it to the glass, his fingers leaving a smear of dark red blood or something worse. His lips moved, forming words I couldn't hear. Then, the reflection twisted again. This time it wasn't just me, it was something else. My body, melting. My skin peeling away, my muscles sloughing off like wet clay. My bones sinking into the cemetery soil, dissolving into the earth like I had never existed. The thing that had been me turned its head. It smiled. I stumbled back, my breath coming short and fast. The reflections pressed against the glass, their mouths still moving, still whispering words I couldn't hear. And then, a crack. Not loud, not sudden, just a slow, deliberate splintering. The glass started to spiderweb. The reflections didn't move, but the crack spread. I turned and ran. I didn't stop until I was back outside, gasping for air, my heart pounding against my ribs. Behind me, deep inside the mausoleum, I swore I heard something shatter. I ran straight out of the mausoleum, my heart still hammering in my chest. The whispers from the reflections lingered in my mind, their meaning just out of reach. The earth was too close, too wrong. I made it back toward the central part of the cemetery, toward the tomb of the silent ones. The tomb was a massive, oppressive structure, dark and foreboding. At first, it looked like any other crypt. Aged stone, ornate carvings, and yet something felt different. I was drawn to it, a strange, magnetic pull. Every step I took felt wrong, like my feet weren't landing on solid ground. As I approached, I noticed the earth was disturbingly soft. I reached out to touch the ground near the tomb and almost recoiled. It was pulsing. At first I thought it was just the natural shifting of the soil, but no, this was something alive. The ground seemed to move beneath my fingers, undulating in slow, rhythmic waves. I stepped back, but the feeling didn't fade. Then I saw them. Bones. Protruding from the earth at twisted angles. Human, yes, but not just human. Some of them were warped, misshapen, broken in ways that shouldn't be possible. They shifted as if they were trying to form words, symbols, an ancient and forbidden language etched in the marrow of the dead. My stomach lurched, and I took another step back, my eyes locked on the bones. As if reacting to my movement, they began to rearrange themselves, slowly at first, then faster, faster until they formed intricate patterns, spiraling and weaving like some grotesque language I couldn't comprehend. Then I heard the whispers, low, guttural sounds rising from deep underground. But they weren't human. These whispers were ancient, too old to belong to anything living. I couldn't make out the words, but there was a sense to them. They felt like memories. Memories of something long lost, of things that had forgotten what it meant to be human. I stepped back again, my legs trembling, and for the first time I truly felt the weight of my actions. The cemetery wasn't just a burial ground. It wasn't just old stones and graves. It was alive. It had always been alive. And I had stepped too far. I turned and walked away quickly, but the whispers followed me. They echoed in the back of my mind, tugging at my thoughts, calling me to return. But I didn't. I couldn't. I made my way back toward the caretaker's booth, my mind spinning with what I had just seen. The night was stretching on. Too long, too much. Every step felt like an eternity. I needed answers. I needed something that could make sense of this, of all the things I had seen, of the grave that was breathing, of the voices that spoke things I couldn't remember, of the reflections that weren't mine. That's when I noticed the journal. It was lying on the booth's desk, as though it had been waiting for me. I had seen it earlier, but I hadn't dared to open it. It looked ordinary enough, like any old leather-bound book. But the moment my hands touched the cover, I felt something stir in the pit of my stomach. The weight of it wasn't normal. It wasn't just the physical weight. This journal was alive. I hesitated for a moment, then opened it. The first page was blank, but as I stared at it, the ink began to shift. Slowly, the words appeared. The first words it wrote were simple. "You shouldn't be here." I froze. How did it know? Before I could respond, before I could even process it, the ink began to move again, this time faster. Words formed, written in a jagged script I couldn't understand, as if the journal was catching up with me, writing down every detail of my thoughts, every memory, every choice I had made in the last few hours. I felt trapped, my heart pounding in my chest, as the words continued to bleed across the page. They weren't just recording events, they were creating them. Then I saw it. A page turned, and the ink formed a horrifying image. Me. The journal depicted my death in vivid, painful detail, an event that hadn't happened yet, but felt imminent. The description was chilling, down to the last detail. The ink described my body, broken and twisted. The cemetery had consumed me, pulling me into its living soil, like it had done with countless others before me. I slammed the book shut, but the ink didn't stop. When I opened it again, another page was filled. This time it was a prophecy of something far worse. The cemetery. It was growing, expanding like a living organism, reaching beyond its borders, swallowing entire towns in its grasp. The pages described it, detailed the destruction, as if it had already happened. But it hadn't. Not yet. I couldn't let that happen. I had to stop it, but I had no idea how. I slammed the journal shut again, but the whispers had started once more. This time, they were louder, more insistent, desperate. I had crossed a line. I knew that now. The ledger, the cemetery, they weren't just passive objects of curiosity. They were waiting, watching, and they had no intention of letting me leave. The truth began to settle into my bones. It wasn't the tombs, it wasn't the reflections, the whispers, or the living journal. No, all of those were pieces of the larger truth, the sickening, impossible truth that hit me all at once, like a slap to the face. The cemetery wasn't just a place. It wasn't a haunted ground, cursed by the dead. It was alive, a living organism, an ancient, sentient ecosystem that consumed much more than just bodies. It fed on memories. It devoured souls. It replaced entire histories. All the pieces clicked into place with terrifying clarity. The ledger, the whispers, the reflections, the living pages of the journal, they weren't just warnings or records of what had happened. They were the cemetery's attempts to communicate with me. The rules weren't for my protection. They weren't meant to keep me safe from the horrors buried here. No, they were a protocol, a twisted, incomprehensible language for negotiating with something that existed on a plane beyond human understanding. The rules were a way for it to control me, to coax me, to slowly bind me to its living web. And all along, I had thought I was the one investigating it. I thought I had chosen to come here, driven by my obsession with history, with the occult. But the reality was far worse. The cemetery had chosen me. It had cultivated my interest, fed my obsession, pushed me deeper into its grasp with surgical precision. Everything I had done, every step I had taken toward uncovering its secrets was exactly what it wanted. It had been watching me, pulling the strings, leading me down this path. My research, my fascination with the lost, forgotten things of the world, it was all part of its plan. It had known from the very start that I was the one it needed, the one it wanted to consume. The truth stung, a bitter realization that twisted in my gut. I had been a pawn, a tool used by something far older, far more patient than I could ever comprehend. And now I was caught in its web. Every rule I followed, every step I took further into the cemetery, was another thread tightening around me. The realization hit me like a ton of bricks. I wasn't investigating the cemetery. The cemetery was investigating me. As the moon rose higher in the sky, casting long, distorted shadows over the gravestones, I realized that my time had run out. The cemetery didn't just want my research, it wanted me. I don't know when I realized it wasn't about following the rules anymore. There was no escape through ritual, no secret path that would lead me out of this nightmare. The rules were just part of the game. Its game. They were designed to keep me contained, but not in the way I thought. Not physically. No, escape wasn't about obeying the rules. It was about understanding the true nature of the cemetery. I had to become part of it, embrace it, in a twisted way, to break free. It hit me in fragments, the pieces of a puzzle I had been too blind to see until now. The cemetery wasn't about keeping its horrors locked away. It was about absorbing its visitors. It didn't just want to trap them, it wanted to merge with them. The rules were the cemetery's way of ensuring its newest member had all the right parts: memories, a soul, fragments of past lives. Each rule was a contract, a necessary step to take before I could leave, if I could leave. But there was no way out without cost. The price of my freedom would be steep. It always was. I reached the tomb of the Silent Ones again. The earth around it pulsed beneath my feet, alive with the cemetery's hunger. I knew I had no choice but to make my peace with it, to accept that I was never meant to leave without leaving something behind. I found the ledger one last time, pages now flickering with fresh ink, words that had never been written before. They stared back at me, an inscription in my own handwriting: to leave is to lose. The cemetery would consume something. It always did. If I wanted to walk away, I would leave behind a piece of myself, something irretrievable, a part of my memory, a fragment of my soul. I didn't hesitate. I had to choose. I had to decide if it was worth it. Dawn was breaking, the light slowly seeping through the trees, casting long, slanted shadows across the graves. The whispers had quieted, the earth had stilled. I walked out of the cemetery, step by heavy step, feeling the weight of what I was leaving behind. But even as I crossed the threshold, the reality of it hit me. The cemetery wasn't leaving me. It followed me. It was in my shadow, in the way the sun seemed to cast my silhouette longer than it should, stretching like a finger, reaching toward the earth beneath my feet. It was in the way the dust clung to my skin, refusing to shake off. It was in the edges of my memories, fragments that would never come back, pieces that felt so far gone, but I knew they were there, hidden deep in the recesses of my mind. The cemetery walked with me, in the silent, unseen spaces between my breaths, in the quiet hum of the world that was now always slightly off, never quite right. I thought I had escaped, but the truth was clearer now than ever. I had never been free. The cemetery had simply changed the rules. And it would never let me go. Years have passed, life moved on, but not for me. The disappearances started slow, just one or two people at first. No signs, no warnings. A drifter, a local, someone whose absence felt more like an oversight than a tragedy. Then another, and people started to notice. And then the rumors began. They talk about a man walking through town at dawn, always just before the sun fully rises, always moving like he has somewhere to be, but never arriving. They say he carries an old, leather-bound ledger, the kind that doesn't belong in this time. Some swear his shadow moves wrong, stretching in ways the morning light shouldn't allow. Others say he doesn't cast one at all. I don't need to hear their stories to know the truth, because I still wake up with dirt under my nails. I still hear the whispers at night, voices slipping through the cracks of my mind, reminding me that I never really left. I walked out of that cemetery, but it walked out with me. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to subscribe for more creepy stories. Stay safe, and see you in the next nightmare.